Jackson Cole was an investigative journalist, always searching for forgotten stories in the most remote corners of America. His latest assignment led him to Black Hollow, a small town in West Virginia with a dark past. In 1978, almost the entire town had mysteriously vanished overnight, leaving only a handful of survivors. The authorities never provided an explanation, and the event was buried in history. Determined to uncover the truth, Jackson arrived in town, unaware of the horrors that awaited him. The main street was eerily quiet. The few open businesses, an old grocery store and a rundown bar, seemed frozen in time. His first stop was Edna Marsh, the town's oldest resident. When she saw Jackson at her door, her eyes narrowed. "You won't find anything here, son," she muttered. But Jackson was persistent. Finally, she glanced away and whispered, "Don't go near the old church by the lake. That's where it all began." She slammed the door shut before he could ask more. Ignoring her warning, Jackson went to the church the next morning. The decayed wooden door creaked as he pushed it open. A strange unease settled in his stomach as he stepped inside. Dust covered the pews, and the air smelled of mold and decay. Near the altar, he found an old leather-bound book. The pages were yellowed, but one line stood out clearly. "He who spills blood will hear the voices." Other entries mentioned a priest and disturbing tales of missing children, cases that were never officially investigated. Hoping to find more clues, Jackson visited the local library. The records were limited, but he discovered whispers of a radical cult that had once lived in Black Hollow. Led by a man called Father Amos, the cult believed in purification through sacrifice. One night, screams had echoed through the town, and by morning most of the population was gone. The few survivors never spoke of what had happened. That night, Jackson struggled to sleep in his motel room. Each time he closed his eyes, he heard faint whispers in the darkness. A deep sense of unease settled over him. Sitting up, he glanced at the door to check the lock, only to realize it was undone. He was certain he had locked it. A cold breath ghosted over his neck, and from the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow disappear into the darkness. He stayed awake until dawn, then hurried back to the church. But something had changed. Symbols, drawn in what looked like blood, now covered the altar. The old book had vanished. Someone knew he had been there. As he turned to leave, a whisper brushed against his ear. "He hears you now, and he will take you too." Panic rising, Jackson ran to the sheriff's office. The sheriff listened in silence, then gave him an unsettling smile. "We told you to leave," he said simply. Jackson glanced outside and noticed the townspeople staring at him, their expressions blank, their eyes devoid of life. Heart pounding, he sprinted to his car and drove toward the town's exit. But as he neared the Black Hollow sign, he saw Edna Marsh standing in the middle of the road. Slamming the brakes, he watched as she slowly approached his window. "The same force that trapped us here will keep you here too," she whispered. Jackson, breathing heavily, restarted the engine and sped away. But no matter how far he drove, he kept ending up at the same town entrance. The road looped endlessly. He screamed in frustration, slamming his fists on the steering wheel. Then, in the rearview mirror, he saw a shadowy figure sitting in the back seat. Jackson Cole was never seen again. Days turned into weeks, and soon, another journalist arrived to investigate his disappearance. In the grocery store's window, an old newspaper clipping displayed a blurry silhouette, one that looked eerily like Jackson. Below it, a chilling caption read, "The town's curse never forgives those who seek the truth." David and Lisa had been longing for a short getaway. Wanting to escape the noise of the big city, they booked an Airbnb in a small town surrounded by dense forests. Their journey was smooth, and when they finally saw the old, faded town sign, a sense of relief washed over them. The town was barely a speck on the map, a place seemingly forgotten by the rest of the world. As they drove through the narrow streets, they saw only a few elderly people walking around. The streetlights were dim, and no one looked out from the houses. The Airbnb they had rented was a rustic stone house at the edge of the town, near the tree line. At first, it seemed normal, but when they found an old shaving brush and a dusty hand mirror in the bathroom, an unsettling feeling crept over them. The place looked like it hadn't been used in months. That evening, they visited the town's only grocery store. When they walked in, the young woman behind the counter gave them an odd look, almost as if she was afraid for them. "Don't go outside after dark," she warned in a hushed tone. David chuckled, thinking it was just small-town superstition, but Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way the other townspeople averted their eyes only made her more uneasy. That night, Lisa woke up screaming. One of the windows was wide open. She was certain they had locked all of them before going to bed. As David shut it, he noticed a shadowy figure standing in the darkness outside. Within seconds, it disappeared. They tried calling the police, but there was no signal. They texted the Airbnb host, but no response came. The next morning, they decided to leave. However, when they reached the main road, they found it completely blocked by fallen trees and rocks, as if someone had deliberately cut off their only way out. They turned around, searching for another route, but every exit road was either collapsed or led to nowhere. Desperate, they went back into town to ask for help. But no one would open their doors. The few people they saw walking around avoided eye contact, turning away in silence. Lisa was on the verge of hyperventilating, while David tried to keep her calm, but deep down, he felt the same terror she did. It was as if they had stepped into a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. The young woman from the grocery store approached them quietly in the town square and slipped a small note into Lisa's hand. "Come to the church at 2 a.m. If you don't, you'll never leave." They exchanged a nervous glance. This was their only lead. When they arrived at the church at midnight, most of the townspeople were already gathered inside. An elderly man explained that the town was cursed. Every year, outsiders who entered had to stay. Forever. Lisa and David felt their stomachs drop as the realization sank in. Everyone who had ever come here had been trapped. Time was running out. They had no choice but to run. Dashing toward the forest, they heard hurried footsteps behind them. As they pushed through the trees, ghostly faces emerged from the darkness. People who had come to the town long ago and had never left. But they weren't human anymore. The next morning, the town resumed its quiet routine. Everything looked normal. A single abandoned car sat at the edge of the road, doors open, empty. And by nightfall, the town would have new visitors arriving. The town's welcome sign was rusted and bent. Below the faded letters of "Welcome to Red Hollow," someone had spray-painted, "Beware." As Stephen drove through the narrow streets, an unsettling feeling crept over him. He had been looking for an escape from the big city, and the old wooden house he rented through Airbnb seemed like the perfect place. But something about the town felt off. The few people he saw avoided eye contact, their hushed whispers disappearing into the chilly air as he passed. He picked up the house key from the town's only grocery store. The cashier, without looking at him, muttered, "Don't go out at night." Stephen brushed it off as small-town superstition. When he arrived at the house, it was old but well-maintained. The wooden floors creaked under his steps, and the stone fireplace had strange carvings along its edges. On one of the shelves, he found a dusty, worn-out notebook. Flipping through it, he saw strange symbols, dates, and names, some crossed out, others left untouched. The most recent entry was just 3 days ago. The first night was quiet, aside from the wind that howled like distant voices murmuring in the dark. But on the second night, he heard something strange, music drifting from the forest. Peering through the window, he saw several figures walking with lanterns, their faint glow flickering between the trees. Curiosity got the best of him. Grabbing his jacket, he stepped outside and followed them. The moonlight cast long, shifting shadows as he moved deeper into the woods. After several minutes, he arrived at an old stone building. A low, rhythmic chanting echoed from within. Stephen crept closer and peeked through a window. Inside, people from the town stood in a perfect circle, their faces void of emotion. Candles flickered around a strange symbol drawn on the floor. In the center, kneeling and bound, was a man trembling in terror. Stephen's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned to leave, but his foot snapped a twig beneath him. The crack echoed through the silence. The chanting stopped. A suffocating stillness filled the air. Then, the door swung open with a creak. Stephen held his breath, taking a slow step backward. But it was too late. The townspeople turned toward him, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He spun around to run, but froze as he saw someone standing behind him. An old man with deep-set eyes. "You weren't supposed to see this," the man said in a low, heavy voice. Hands grabbed Stephen roughly, pulling him inside the building. The bound man was gone. Only his clothes and shoes remained. The circle of townspeople reformed, their empty gazes locked onto the now vacant space at the center. Stephen struggled, but the grip on his arms was unrelenting. A tall figure in a hooded robe stepped forward, holding a blade that gleamed in the candlelight. "Newcomers are always curious," he said, his voice chillingly calm. "And every curious soul must become part of the town." Panic surged through Stephen as he thrashed against their hold. His breath came in ragged gasps. He scanned the room for an escape, but every exit was blocked. Then, a scream cut through the air. Someone stood at the doorway. At first, Stephen thought it was another townsperson, but then he saw the man's face, pale, hollow, eyes completely black. It was the same man who had been bound moments ago. The townspeople fell into eerie silence. The man took a slow step inside and whispered, "You forgot about me." The candles suddenly extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. Chaos erupted. Stephen used the distraction to break free and bolted for the door. It was unlocked. Without hesitating, he sprinted into the forest, ignoring the screams behind him. The moonlight barely guided his way, but he didn't stop. The only thing on his mind was getting as far from that cursed town as possible. By sunrise, Stephen found himself at the town's exit. His car was still there, parked along the roadside. He yanked the door open, jumped inside, and started the engine, speeding away without looking back. But as he glanced at the rearview mirror, his stomach dropped. Beneath the rusted "Welcome to Red Hollow" sign, new words had been carved into the wood: "Never come back."